Well, let's stay with international matters but get into a different discussion now. Ireland has joined South Africa's genocidal intent case against Israel. This is over its military offensive in Gaza. Dublin is asking the International Court of Justice to broaden the definition of genocide to include the blocking of humanitarian aid. The United Nations is warning of imminent famine in the enclave. Let's speak now about this matter with political analyst Musa Mdunge, who talks to us all the way from Scotland this evening. Mr. Mdunge, good evening to you and thank you very much for your time. The Irish Foreign Minister says he plans to petition the ICJ over what he says is a pattern of behavior by Israel to block humanitarian aid into Gaza. In fact, in his actual commentary, he talks about a collective punishment of the entire population. You think he has this one spot on?
Good evening, Coley, and good evening to your viewers. Indeed, the minister is indeed spot on in terms of this one, and it is not surprising that the Republic of Ireland would take such a position. As you know, the island is of the EU members, perhaps the most ardent supporter of Palestine and a critic of Israel in terms of its occupation of Palestinian land and the apartheid state that continues to ensue currently. And this position is quite important and consequential because what we are seeing, Chloe, is a movement by the global south to hold the global north accountable for their actions and complacency, if I may add, in terms of this particular conflict and what is happening in Palestine currently, and to call to account Israel to take steps that would ensure that it prevents any actions that would be considered genocide. And so I do believe that in the spirit of the preamble of the United Nations, that all nations have signed up upon, that there is a responsibility by Israel and its allies to ensure that genocide ceases.
Well, in a statement this evening issued by the South African government, which says it welcomes the additional provisional measures that have now been ordered by the ICJ since the South African government went back to that court on an urgent basis requesting on the 6th of March for further provisional measures. Now the court is saying that South Africa's assertion that the situation in Gaza had deteriorated significantly since the court's order of 26 January 2024 as a result of Israel's failure to comply with the order. Therefore, it has become necessary for the court to indicate these further provisional measures. I wonder whether there is something to be said there, Mr. Mdunge, about the ICJ's own pace in this particular matter of urgent provisional measures, because now it would seem that the court is somehow being cajoled. They are suggesting that famine has set in because people have died. And let me be specific. 31 people, including 27 children, have already died of malnutrition and dehydration. Does the court perhaps feel a sense of pressure right now?
Certainly, there is a pressure on the ICJ to make more definitive, decisions on this matter. Unfortunately, while the ICJ can rule as it would, it is to the United Nations that any provisions taken by or called by the ICJ would actually have to be actioned. And that is perhaps where we are stuck in terms of the international system as we see it today. The United Nations does not work. More specifically, the Security Council is in gridlock because 5 nations have the power of the veto. And we see how the United States, though in the last resolution that just got passed, chose to abstain, but even then, in responding to that resolution, it said that the provisions of that resolutions are not binding to Israel, who is its ally. So the ICJ, because from the point of the United Nations, from the point more specifically of Israel and how it has acted and the complacency of its allies, is definitely under pressure to take more definitive steps here and to indeed call particularly the fact that humanitarian aid is being blocked and Israel has failed to implement any of the provisions that the ICJ has called on is indeed the pressure that we are seeing set. Now the question then becomes, Xoli, is then what are the ramifications for the allies? And we see this in terms of the action that a country like Nicaragua is taking against Germany, accusing it of being complacent in genocide in terms of this matter. So we are seeing, as I said, the global south holding the global north to account. And what we are seeing come to bear here is the soft power of middle powers and regional powers, such as South Africa and Ireland. And let me say this, Xoli, if I may add, that we must remember that we are living in a world of post 9/11, post the intervention in Iraq by the United States. And you will recall that in 2005, the leaders of the world gathered in a summit, and there they declared that there was a responsibility to protect, that countries had a responsibility to protect all people around the world against acts of genocide and crimes against humanity. And this is at the heart of this particular case that we are seized with, is all countries take up that responsibility as they have set in terms of international law.
Two quick questions in one as we close the conversation. The posture of the United States lately, I don't think that we are asleep to realize that the United States is changing its tune. First, they chose to abstain in this latest resolution, which, by the way, chose to pass the draft resolution for a ceasefire. But also, they have been very clear that civilian casualties in this war are simply too high, and therefore Israel has got to do something about that, including humanitarian aid that needs to get in on an urgent basis. So bear that in mind. And then I've got a question for the ICJ. If they are the ones that are now saying provisional measures, we actually agree, Israel, submit a report so that we are able to see that you are not implementing a genocide here. How difficult will it be for that court to not find that Israel has indeed been engaged in genocidal acts against the people of Palestine?
Certainly, Xoli, there is a swing and a shift that has happened here with the United States seemingly breaking rank with tradition. But unfortunately, again, I point out this point that there was almost this step back from this redemption that the United States had by abstaining, by them already arguing that in actual fact, this ought not to be called a genocide, and two, that as much as Israel has this responsibility here, that more needs to be done in terms of calling Hamas to account. And so, yes, the ICJ may be called to take a stronger stance on this issue. But remember, Xoli, that these cases take years. And fundamentally, it will be up to the states, up to all countries in the United Nations to then be able to take more stronger positions on this matter. For example, the United Kingdom currently is seized with the question of whether to impose on Israel an arms embargo where they would not sell military weapon and technology to Israel. this is quite a significant move for a country that, like the United States, has been perhaps the closest of allies to Israel. And so as we see divisions in the G7, as we see the global south led by the BRICS nations take up stronger positions and calling on all nations to remember that most sacred call of the responsibility to protect, it is clear in this year, Xoli, a year, I remind you, where 50 countries are going to elections, where democracy will be tested, where the idea of the time that we're existing in is the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama once said, at the end of the Cold War. I will remind you, Xoli, that peace is the bedrock by which all human rights find expression, including the right to life. And so fundamentally, this is what South Africa and these countries are calling for, that there must be a peaceful resolution to the conflict and fundamentally a return to possibly a two-state solution.
Musa Mdunge, thank you very much for your analysis of this situation. He is a PhD candidate and political analyst at the University of Dundee.